Let's take a break from politics. Just for one or two videos, and then we'll get back to it. There's a couple more things I want to say. We still haven't covered power and the uses thereof and how organizations come into conflict when they do come into conflict. But if you want some homework to do, I recommend you go play a game. You can play it online called Diplomacy. Pretty much everything I'm going to say in the upcoming Power video is covered in that game. And I want to start a series where we cover adventures that I have run and what I learned from them, specifically adventures that I liked and that I thought were good, and hopefully that will be useful to you. But gosh, I am burned out on politics right now for obvious reasons, so I'd like to do a sequel to a video we did a little while ago, the NPC video. There were a couple of subjects regarding NPCs that I left out that I really wanted to cover, but I ran out of time, and so this is NPCs 2. This episode, we're going to talk about running high-level NPCs and when and under what circumstances they should help the players, and what happens when you end up having to run a character in the party. There's a classic adventure written by Gary Gygax called T1, The Village of Hamlet. Here's a picture of it. And I've used this many times. It's a great starting area for adventure. It's a town. It's a very well detailed. It's probably over detailed because it describes all the NPCs in this town and like how much money they have and where they hide their copper pieces. Because it was written back in the advanced Dungeons and Dragons days where Gary imagined that thief players would want to try out their skills, even though it wasn't necessarily being evil. It was just the thief. It's like playing a video game. You go house to house and you want to pick the pockets of all the people in the different houses and see what they've got. So Gary detailed everything in this town, including every NPC's belongings, which is kind of crazy. But it also has a nearby dungeon. There are some high-level NPCs here in Hamlet. And the question immediately arises, if there's a 7th level druid, for instance, in Hamlet, and there is, and he's not the only high-level character, and they're good guys, and they're going to end up being the patrons of the heroes, why aren't they dealing with the problems in this town? And frankly, I don't think there's a good answer in this adventure. I think Gary Gygax, the author of this adventure and the architect of our hobby, put those high-level characters in here because they represent player characters that his friends, the people who played in his games, played in this area and through these events. And for Gary, part of the fun of playing D&D was when you rolled up new characters and you started playing for the first time, you were playing in the same world as all these other players who had come before you, and many of them had achieved high level. That's where these characters come from. And had retired. But retirement didn't mean they, took up basket weaving. It meant retiring from adventuring. They had bigger problems, bigger fish to fry. A wizard, for instance, somebody like Byrne, might be researching spells rather than going dungeon crawling. So the purpose of having, at least for Gary, and at least in this adventure, the reason I think there were high-level adventurers, other high-level NPCs on the same side as the heroes, was because he wanted the players to feel like, wow, these are other player characters that have been through these events and shaped the world. The things they did shaped the world, and now it's our turn. And the things we do will shape the world, and then other players will come after us. You will end up running for other people later on, and they will meet our retired characters in Hamlet. Gary explicitly talks about this, by the way, in the adventure. He talks about these are friends of his characters, and he likes the idea that they shaped the world, and now you're going to do it. And that is a tradition that I am part of. When I started playing D&D, it was in a world run by a friend of mine, Brad, that he had inherited from his older brother, Matt. And so there were these high-level NPCs running around that used to be player characters in Matt's campaign. So anytime Brad needed to know, what would this character do? What would this high-level NPC do? What would the Fire Prince do? He would just ask Matt's friends who played these characters, and they would tell him. And that's something that's been a really popular idea in my videos, is the notion of when you have important NPCs in your world, give them to your friends who can't play, and then just call them up or text them every once in a while and say, hey, the heroes are doing this and they're asking for help. Would you be willing to give them help for this? What would you ask for in return? And you'll find that when your friends are running high-level NPCs in your world, they think of stuff you would never have thought of, and it saves you a lot of work, frankly. So that's one use of high-level NPCs, but you sort of have to come up with an answer to the question, because the players inevitably, every time I've run this, the players have inevitably asked, wait, why don't these high-level NPCs just take care of these problems? Why are they, these bad guys in the nearby dungeon are threatening the town, and if they succeed, the world. Why don't these folks do anything about it? Well, the answer, I think, is, the implied answer, I don't think it's stated in the adventure, is these high-level characters, as I said earlier, have bigger fish to fry. For instance, the players in my first game at work at Turtle Rock Studios, where I am the lead writer, when they were going through their low-level sandbox game, 1st to 5th level, eventually they met the Baron of Tor and her high-level cleric ally. This was the guy who ran the church, and he was somebody who could cast blessings on them, give them potions, and if they proved loyal to the Baron, ultimately could cast Raise Dead on them. Very useful dude to know. So why doesn't this guy just go take care of Colville the Vile, the villain of this low-level sandbox game? Well, I talked about him always being away from the barony. He was rarely there. He was off fighting hobgoblins. Why was he fighting hobgoblins? Well, because I was setting up, I was seeding the adventure that these players would be having after they hit 5th level, after they dealt with Colville the Vile, the first boss. They would go through this adventure. They would go through the Red Hand of Doom, which I have run before and which is fantastic. I think it's universally considered one of the best adventures TSR ever put out. So knowing that this is the adventure they're going to be going through later, and that this is a high-level adventure, and therefore the stakes are higher, right? The Tiamat is in danger of being summoned, which is a bigger problem than what Colville the Vile is dealing with, then the players can plausibly imagine, oh yeah, that's why this high-level NPC is not worried about our problems. You can always, therefore, imply that these high-level NPCs, the nearby wizard, who can identify items for you, right, the Elrond character, can identify your items and tell you, oh, that's a magic ring, let me tell you what it does, let me tell you the provenance of these swords you found. You can always tell your players that these high-level NPCs like Elrond have bigger fish to fry than the little problems the heroes are dealing with, and they just have to trust that the heroes will deal with it because they were once low-level heroes themselves. I mean, Elrond's a bad example for that, but you get what I mean. But instead of implying that they're dealing with larger problems, you can explicitly seed the hook for the next adventure these players will be dealing with once they've solved these local problems, like the Red Hand of Doom, for instance. So it helps to know where your campaign's going to be going, so you can use these high-level NPCs. For instance, a great example is when Gandalf leaves in the middle of The Hobbit. Where is he going? What's he dealing with? He's going to deal with the Necromancer. You don't know who that is, but it sounds super cool. We can imagine that that's Tolkien seeding the next adventure. If the players work for these high-level NPCs and show that they are loyal and do quests for them and show that they are capable, then you can imagine that when the chips are down and their backs are against the wall, these high-level NPCs might show up to get their fat out of the fire, so to speak. And I've done that. I've done that successfully. So you'll find a lot of advice online that says the players shouldn't ever rely on these high-level NPCs. And I think that's accurate. And the key there is rely, right? I have had my players, in fact, the first time I ran Night Below, which was in the 1990s, the players were, I think, 5th or 6th level, and they ended up in a fight with this Shadow Dragon. And back in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, back in 2nd edition, Shadow Dragons breathed negative levels. So if you failed your saving throw, I mean, forget failing, if you succeeded your saving throw, you automatically lost levels, just not as many levels as if you failed your saving throw. And that's a death spiral, right? That's one of those situations where once you start losing levels, you are overwhelmingly more likely to fail that combat and just get annihilated. So in that situation, especially there was a point where 2 of the players, a paladin and a thief, decided we are going to stand our ground and hold off this dragon with whatever power we have left so the rest of you can escape. And I was like, wow, this is a really selfless act. And I could have let those heroes die so the others could escape, but I wanted to reward their selfless act. So I had this high-level NPC wizard who had been a patron to the players up until now. I had him show up in the middle of the Underdark and engage in battle with the Shadow Dragon. It was very Deus Ex Machina. It would have been, I think, bad writing if it had been written down, but because they had never relied on this high-level NPC wizard for anything other than like scrolls and potions and advice, when he suddenly showed up to save their lives, they were thrilled. They thought it was epic. They had no idea he might do that. They had never considered, well, we have to hope our high-level patron saves us, because that wasn't the relationship they had with him. I made sure to describe his arrival in an epic way, and he commands the heroes to flee and that he'll take care of this, and they retreated to a safe distance and watched this epic battle between a Shadow Dragon, which is a high-level dragon with its own spells, and this high-level NPC, and it was really, it was dramatic and cool, and they felt validated is how they felt. They felt like having this wizard as an ally and doing all those things for him had finally paid off in a way they had never considered before. And I think that's an important point. You can use your high-level NPCs that the players have met and dealt with as opportunities to save the heroes and get them out of trouble when they get in over their heads. It just has to feel earned. It can't feel like a gimme. It can't feel like DM fiat, right? Like you're just waving a magic wand and solving all their problems. That's not how my players felt in that moment. Of course, later I made their lives a little bit more complex, because when they tried to rely on that wizard later, he had been kidnapped by the Aboleth in Night Below, which was kind of the whole plot of the adventure in the first place. And then they were even more motivated to find out what was going on in the Underdark, because this guy that had saved their lives was now, his life was threatened and it was their opportunity to save him. So you can see how it is possible to use high-level NPCs to help out the players when they need it. It just can't be something that happens regularly. It has to sort of come out of the blue, and the players have to understand why. They have to feel like, yes, we have helped this guy a lot. He is a patron of ours. We did quests for him, and this is where all that finally pays off. If they're sitting around looking at their watches going, gosh, I hope Gandalf shows up to save us, then it doesn't feel the same. It has to feel like it's kind of coming out of left field. I'll tell you, I've had 2 other instances that were notable where I, as a player, encountered notorious, famous, high-level NPCs, and one of them I thought it worked really well, and the other one it didn't work so well, and so let's talk about that. I was playing in my friend Steve Howard's DC Heroes game. Alas, Steve is no longer with us, but it was a fantastic game. He was a good friend of mine, and he loved comics. He loved DC Heroes, so did I. We were playing relatively low-level superheroes in a kind of Long Beach, California, like Southern California area. We had our own city. You know that tradition where Batman has a city, that's Gotham, and Superman has his own city, that's Metropolis? Well, we had our own city. I don't remember what he called it. It might have been San Angelo. We had been adventuring this campaign for a couple months, and our quests finally took us to Star Labs, which is a famous high-tech research facility in the DC universe. And when we went there, the Flash was there. This was the first time in Steve's campaign where we had met a notorious, famous character from this existing universe we were playing in. We had all known the entire time that Superman's out there somewhere, Batman's out there somewhere. This was a role-playing game set in the DC universe. But we had never met any of those characters, and this was the first time, and I was playing a speedster. I was playing Mr. In-Between, who I remember his backstory was he experienced different plank times than normal people, so he's flickering in and out of reality, and that lets him speed up or slow down and do crazy stuff. So my character had a sort of semi-professional interest in the Flash, and I recognized him and said, "You're Wally West," which was playing on my knowledge of current DC continuity. And that was super cool. I remember being really kind of blown away that I got to, even though I was in my 20s, right? I was an adult by any reasonable definition. I got to interact with the Flash, and the way Steve played him was believable and grounded. And I never felt like, this is, when the magic is working. I didn't feel like I was talking to Steve. I felt like my character was talking to the Flash, and that was neat. Suspension of disbelief becomes harder to pull off as you get older. It just means you need to work harder for it. That's why I tell everybody to get started playing D&D when you're young, because that's when the belief comes easiest. So it was super cool to spend part of a session talking to the Flash. It made us feel like we were playing in a DC comic book. In that instance, because the Flash was there for his own reasons, and he had some knowledge of what we were dealing with and was able to impart some information, but he couldn't really solve our problems for us, doing that didn't make us feel like we weren't important. It didn't steal our thunder. In fact, it validated our existence. It made us feel more like superheroes. I want to contrast that with another game in which I met some famous NPCs that didn't work that well. It was a game run by a friend of mine set in the Legend of the Five Rings universe. I've talked about this game before. I talked about the collectible card game, which I think has the best story in any game ever, including any video game. But this was the role-playing game. And I sort of bullied a friend of mine into running a game for my friends and I at work. When I say bully, it wasn't his idea, and I kind of just pestered him about it over and over until he gave in. My friends and I, he knew that my friends and I were huge fans of the original Legend of the Five Rings story. This story wasn't published anywhere. You had to play the collectible card game to know what was going on, and we loved it. So he had the idea, and this is a very clever idea, of running us through a Legend of the Five Rings campaign set during that era, set during the Clan War, but in a kind of mirror universe where all the same actors are on the stage, but they're all playing different parts. This was a very clever idea. The problem was it ended up being a tour of the setting and the famous NPCs, and my friends and I never got to do anything. We were always just standing around watching these famous characters solving problems and coming into conflict on their own. And after a couple of weeks of this, we cooled on the idea. It didn't work because the high-level NPCs who were famous and notorious, and we knew them, were doing everything cool, and we didn't get to do much. Now, that wasn't because he was a bad DM. Far from it. I had played many games with him, and he was fantastic. He is a famously good DM, but this wasn't his idea, so kind of backed into a corner. He ran the game that he was interested in. And that's always the DM's prerogative. It's always the DM who has to be comfortable with the game that they are running. This is the game I'm interested in running. If no one's interested in playing, then we'll do something else. We'll play Talisman or whatever. That was the game my friend was interested in running, and we went through it, but ultimately it wasn't satisfying and we stopped. And the lesson there is we weren't the ones doing the cool stuff. In the instances where high-level NPCs have shown up and solved problems and it worked, it was because it was super rare and felt earned. When it happened all the time and it didn't feel earned, then we felt like, well, you don't need us. There's nothing for us to do. So you can deploy high-level NPCs to help your heroes out, but it has to be the kind of thing that is done after the heroes have proved their worth and shown this high-level NPC that they are loyal, that they are capable, and ideally it would happen in a moment where the heroes weren't expecting it. Then the heroes think, this is amazing. Then the heroes feel like it's a reward, like the story is rewarding them for being awesome. Then it validates everything they've done instead of pulling the rug out from under them. Okay, that was high-level NPCs. Now let's talk about you running a character, because this is going to happen sooner or later, you running a character in the party with the other players. It used to be back in the old days that players would often hire kind of unskilled laborers to follow them around and maybe carry the torch for them because the players want to have their hands free to carry weapons and shields shields or cart all their gold back to town. And because they worked for pay, these were called hirelings. And you can find rules in the old games for how many hirelings you could recruit based on your charisma. And it was kind of part of a game mechanic where Gary Gygax, the designer, was trying to challenge the players in different ways. So for instance, you kill the dragon, you get his treasure, congratulations, splitting it up, you all get 8,000 gold pieces, but it's all in copper, which means you each just found 800,000 copper pieces or whatever that turns out to be. And now the challenge isn't how do we kill the dragon? We solved that problem. The challenge is how do we get all this copper back to town? That's where hirelings come in, and then negotiating with hirelings becomes its own challenge. And that's how Gary ran a game back then. He was always trying to come up with new ways. Once the players got used to something, like finding treasure in gold pieces and it not being a problem storing it, now he tried to challenge them in a new way, saying, okay, you find a whole bunch of money, congratulations, but it's all in copper pieces, and now the challenge is how to get it back to town. But we don't really use that tradition anymore, so we don't really have the idea of hirelings as far as I know. I worry a lot less about things like where is the light source in the group, so the players don't have to worry about hiring someone who is just there to hold the torch so that they can have their hands free to cast spells and stuff. But you can end up having to run a character in the party with the other players for a lot of reasons. For one thing, something that happens every once in a while is somebody's not around and can't play and they need someone else to play their character. How you deal with that is up to you. Sometimes I take it easy on new players and I will run their character for them if they're not around, but typically what I say is you have to find another player to run your character for you. I have enough stuff to do. And if you can't, then your character just sits the adventure out for some, nonsense reason we'll come up with, like you couldn't be roused from your slumber, maybe you were poisoned in the last session. Back when we didn't really care about narrative and story, we would describe characters as de-resing and then re-resing. Yeah, literally like that. But inevitably, you'll end up in a situation where the players do not have every class they need to solve a problem. For whatever reason, they need a cleric, for instance, or they're trying to track somebody and they need a ranger. And so they go to town or they go to the local druid or forest and they try to recruit someone to help them. And you're going to have to play that character. And then you're stuck trying to figure out who plays this newly recruited NPC. Do I play the NPC? Does the player who recruited them play him? Now, there's no right answer. You're free to do it however you want. But what I typically do is I have the player who has recruited an NPC play that NPC in combat, but I roleplay them. I know their personality and their motivations, and I will allow the player to run them in combat unless the player is going to do something ridiculous that I don't think that character would do. Because these characters are still free agents. They're allies of the heroes, but they're not a second character. They're still independent agents that I am in charge of. So I delegate some of the responsibility and say, here's their character sheet, you run them in combat, while I roleplay them and describe what they say and what they think. And it's often very useful to have an NPC in the party with the other heroes because then you have a voice, you can suggest things, and that can help the players out of a jam if they haven't noticed something, or if you've told them something that you expected to have some import and the players missed it. If you have an NPC that you are running in the party, then you can have that NPC notice that thing or make a connection. And I will typically, I'm better at this now than I was when I was 15, but I will typically make sure, I've said this in other videos, that if I am running an NPC in the party with the players, that NPC, they cannot be trusted. There's always going to be some degradation of signal fidelity, that these NPCs are often wrong or are reckless or sometimes are just dumb or just value different things than the players do and don't see the world the way the players do. Maybe the ranger is a half-orc ranger and has a completely different mindset than these, civilized adventuring heroes. Because I never want the players to feel like if this NPC says something, it's the gospel and they can take it to the bank. I don't know why you would take the gospel to the bank. I think of those characters as allies because they're still independent agents. They are on the side of the heroes. They are willing to help the heroes out, usually not for pay. They're not hirelings. They are ideologically aligned with the heroes and trying to solve the same problems, but there are times in your game where the heroes will recruit what is effectively a second character. There will be other times in your game where your heroes will do something extraordinary and will end up recruiting what is effectively a second character. For instance, my friend Silvano was playing a Dragonborn Paladin and had just saved the town of Orlane. He had defeated the cult of the Reptile God and the Reptile God. There will be other times in your game where your heroes will do something extraordinary and will end up recruiting what is effectively a second character. For instance, my friend Silvano was playing a Dragonborn Paladin and had just saved the town of Orlane. He had defeated the cult of the Reptile God and the Reptile God. That's the part that's missing from the title of the classic adventure, Against the Cult of the Reptile God. It should say, Against the Cult of the Reptile God. Oh, and by the way, the Reptile God that they are the cult of, you also have to defeat her, period. That, I think we can agree, would be a much better title. So he was now famous, and he was one of Good King Omen's Dragon Knights, so he was already sort of mythological, and after having saved the town, he's walking to the inn, and he sees sees a young girl carrying a whole bunch of pots and pans. He doesn't know, but she's the blacksmith's daughter going and taking a bunch of stuff to be repaired to her father, and she sees this famous knight and drops everything and runs away. A little while later, she showed up at the inn with a sword she couldn't wield and armor that was too big for her and pledged service to Sir Razalax. And Sylvana was like, right on, yeah, this is cool. And she became his squire, and she was his character. I made her a bard, right? Because she wanted to literally sing his praises. She was like his herald. Makes perfect sense for a knight to have a herald. And that was a character that he and I basically shared. He wasn't 100% comfortable. Doesn't have to be black and white. He wasn't 100% comfortable deciding what this other character would do, but he didn't mind running her in combat. And also there were times when he decided what his squire would think or do or say to somebody else. He was a brand new player, so it's perfectly natural for him to feel weird meeting an NPC, and then suddenly this NPC is his character. But I definitely looked at it as, she is your character, she is yours to run. And ultimately I thought, and this is also useful, if something happened to Sir Razalax and he couldn't be raised from the dead, if they didn't have a priest ally that could help them, he would just end up playing his squire if he wanted to. It was just this other character he had in his back pocket. There's another way I use followers, and that's in my Stronghold system. And this is stuff that I got from earlier editions of the game. A lot of this stuff comes from various Dragon magazines, but if you get to around 7th level, you will want to, in my game, typically, not all players, want to build a stronghold. If you're a fighter, you want to build a keep. If you're a wizard, you want to build a wizard's tower, because you get cool wizard abilities, and you get the ability to, for instance, if you're a wizard, make new spells. And once your keep is done and you've defended it, you get to roll on the follower chart. Because you're famous now, you are attracting attention. People in the area know who you are and approve of you, because you've probably saved the local area a couple times by now. And then every time you improve your stronghold, you get to roll in this chart. It's the follower chart, and a lot of the things on here are mundane. A couple of scribes show up and pledge service to you and want to live in your keep. Now, if you have scribes in your stronghold and you know a wizard, or you are a wizard, then they can make scrolls for you. Or maybe you roll on here and you get some number of carpenters who show up and pledge service. They want to live in the village surrounding your keep, and now you get improvements to your keep at a lower cost. Or if you roll really high, it's a percentile chart. If you roll near the 0, you start getting crazy stuff, like maybe a stone giant walks out of the forest and says, hey, I've heard a lot about you. I approve of what you're doing. I want to help you out. Now, that stone giant doesn't belong to the players. It's an ally of the players. It's not another character for the player to run. And the stone giant is kind of like one of these high-level NPCs. He's doing his own thing. He is living his own life. He worries about stuff. He worries about giant things, right? What you up to? Not much, just giant things out in the forest. But he can occasionally be counted on to defend the character's keep if they're away, for instance, or arrive mysteriously and deliver ominous news about things happening in the forest. The stone giant might be a character that arrives to save the player's bacon if things get tough. And there's stuff on this chart like a dragon might end up being your ally, and when the dragon shows up and presents themselves and says, hey, I like what you've been doing, good job building a keep, maybe they don't look like a dragon. Dragons are also powerful magic users and can cast polymorph. Maybe they show up looking like an elf princess. In those instances, these high-level followers, I mean, this is one of the reasons players in my game want to make strongholds, is so they can roll on this chart. I have rolled on these charts in earlier games that I played in the 80s and 90s in my friends' campaigns. It was really neat when I was playing in my friend Brad's campaign and I rolled on my chart because I was a paladin and I had built a temple or a church or something, and I got a gray dragon that pledged itself to me. I think I rolled like a 98 on the chart. And because of the way it was presented to me, I never felt like, this has a lot to do with tradition. Because of the way it was presented to me, I never felt like this gray dragon was mine to command or anything like that. I felt like I had been recognized by one of the great powers in the area and that it wanted to help me out. That's it. The gray dragon could be relied upon to give me useful information. It knew things. Whenever we were trying to do research or find out what was going on, I had this gray dragon in my pocket. I could go talk to them and say, hey, do you know anything about this? And that gray dragon could help and send us on quests. Or the gray dragon might say, I'm not sure about that. Let me go do my own research. And there was a time when a bunch of elves showed up at my keep when I wasn't there and tried to take it, and my dragon defended it. And that was a super useful, cool thing to find out. That notion that you leave your stronghold behind in the charge of a lieutenant, and then you come back and the lieutenant says, let me tell you what happened while you were gone. That is super neat. It really helps sell the idea of your campaign as a living world. So we talked about hirelings, we talked about followers, we talked about the players running like essentially a second NPC. We talked about the kind of crazy followers you get when you make a stronghold. But there is definitely a trap you can fall into. A lot of DMs have fallen into it. I am sure I have in the past, especially when I was younger, and that's called the DMPC. Meaning the dungeon master's player character, the idea of you as a dungeon master really wishing you could play and being frustrated that you can't play. And so eventually you hit upon the idea, perfectly natural, of saying, listen, it's my game. Why don't I just roll up my own character and I will play my own character in my own campaign for which I am the DM. And that, I mean, anytime somebody tells me they're doing that, I go, alert, alert, because I've never seen that really work out well. Players, even if they've never had this experience before, very quickly recognize that this super cool, unique, flamboyant NPC that you've introduced is really the character you'd like to be playing. And this is one of those instances where they start to feel like you're getting to do all the cool stuff and they end up just being audience members. There is a natural feedback loop when you're the dungeon master and you're a player in your own game to give your character the cool plot hooks and give your character the cool rewards. That's one of the reasons I make sure if I'm running an NPC in the party, they're either very inexperienced, or they might just not be that clever, or they might be so, glory driven that they want to commit suicide at every turn and die in battle. There's always something about the NPCs that I am running in the party. I'm not talking about the high level characters that they meet out in the world. I'm talking about folks that join them that I have to run. There's always something about these characters that make them not the perfect hero. Somewhat obviously deficient in some way. For instance, if you go watch the one-on-one session I ran with my friend Gertz, we played for 4 hours. There's a video of it on YouTube, and he was all by himself. It was a one-on-one session, and he was playing a fighter, so I'm like, okay, well, he's going to need some help. He's going to need an ally, at least one, and let's make it a cleric so there's somebody that can cast healing spells on him. And so I created Edric, and Edric was kind of useless, but he was super fun to play. He was a coward, but he was loyal. And he never gave Gertz any advice, even when Gertz, the player, was turning to him, trying to get information out of him. What should I do? Let me know. And he was hoping Matt Colville would have Edric say something to resolve ambiguity. I'm like, no, man, I didn't say this explicitly. I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, you, Gertz, are the hero. He is your sidekick. He's not going to solve this problem for you. He is with you thick or thin. Even if you make what turns out to be the wrong decision, Edric is going to back it. So even though you want to play very badly and you feel like, man, I do all this work to run the game for my friends, why can't I have a player in my game? I have never seen that work out well. So even though you very badly want to play and you feel like I've done all this work, why can't I play a character in my game? I strongly advise you against it. Instead, I encourage you to tell your friends, listen, we're getting to a good stopping place in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And at that point, one of you has to run and I want to play. Otherwise, let's just play Talisman or something. Or given that we're in the middle of the politics series, maybe play Diplomacy or something. Just make sure that you're playing Diplomacy with your friends and you're not in a concealed carry state, because if somebody in your Diplomacy game has a weapon, they are going to kill somebody. If you don't know what I mean, play Diplomacy. So that's the second NPC video. We talked about high-level NPCs, when it is okay for them to save the character's bacon, and also how to sort of avoid the idea of high-level NPCs stealing the player's thunder. It's perfectly reasonable for the players to meet famous, high-level, powerful characters, as long as those characters are doing their own thing and only helping out the players incidentally. We talked about hirelings, although only briefly, because I think they are somewhat out of fashion. We talked about followers. We talked about players recruiting their own, basically, second character. We talked about cool high-level followers the players can get, like a stone giant or a dragon. And that seems like a lot to cover. So that's the second NPC video. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any other NPC-related topics you'd like to hear me cover. I knew when I did that first NPC video that I was almost certainly not going to cover everything I could think of in one video. In other news, people send stuff to my office, to where I work at Total Rock Studios. One of my subscribers, Firth is a Word, sent me this awesome copy. I've never seen this edition before, of The Once and Future King by T.H. White. There is probably no book that had a bigger impact on my ethics, my worldview, on who I am as an adult than this book. So thank you, Firth. Darren Baldwin sent me this great adventure. It's kind of a tie-in to some of the PAX Acquisitions Incorporated content that they do with the guys at Penny Arcade. And I think it also relates in some way to Storm King's Thunder. I'm not sure exactly how. I may do a contest and I'm not doing a contest yet. I may do a contest and give this away if I can find. I was thinking about doing maybe like a trivia contest where I ask some obscure bit of information about my campaign setting that we've talked about in the campaign diaries or something. But I'm not sure. Every time we've done a contest, it gets progressively harder to sift through the thousands of comments in the blah blah down below. So I'm not sure. Maybe that's the name for the comments. There's the doobly-doo, which is the information about the video, and then there's the blah blah, which is the comments. So there's got to be a better way for us to do giveaways and stuff like that, rather than just saying post in the comments below and then me later have to sift through thousands of comments. Right? No surprise, right? YouTube comments are not designed for contests and giveaways. Just one of many ways in which YouTube is ill-suited to the purposes that we are putting it to. But I'll think of something. We'll come up with some cool way to give this away. Thanks, Darren. I encourage anybody who might want to help support the channel to come by my Amazon page. There's a link in the doobly-doo. I write fantasy novels. Some people like them. You might like them. Who knows? Next episode, we will probably go back to politics. I just thought that we needed a break for a little while, talk about something else. And in that spirit, I wanted to say that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And never let anybody tell you that a small group of dedicated people can't change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Until next time, peace out.